Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to speak about an amendment to the pending matter when it becomes an amendment I intend to file when it becomes procedurally appropriate to do so. The amendment I intend to file is about our foreign aid to the nation of Egypt. And let me just start by talking about foreign aid in general, because there's a lot of debate about that and a lot of concern around the country about foreign aid. In fact, in a lot of places where I go, people ask me, with things so tough here in the United States, why do we give money to other countries? Why are we giving money to other countries? And that's a very good question to ask. First, I would just say, and I would caution people, that foreign aid is not 20% of our budget. It's not 30% of our budget. It's actually on some days less than 1%, 2%, 3% of our total budget. And secondly, I would say to you that foreign aid has a very useful role. Just to set the table, I think people need to understand that our foreign aid has accomplished a tremendous amount of good around the world. For example, the U.S. aid programs to fight HIV/AIDS in Africa has helped save millions of people. Millions of people are alive today because of the generosity of the American taxpayer. It's helped to alleviate poverty. I think you look at some of the great examples of foreign aid, like the Marshall Plan or the work we undertook to rebuild Japan and the alliances we have today as a result. One of the great stories of foreign aid is South Korea, a nation that was long a beneficiary of foreign aid, not just from the United States, but from the world, and today is a donor in many of these forums. So these are the good news about foreign aid. And foreign aid is important because it increases our influence. It's part of how we can influence what is increasingly a global economy. I think that's important to understand, that when people talk about the American economy, we don't just live in a national economy anymore. We live in a world where increasingly things that happen to you on a daily basis, the price of things that you're buying, some of these things are set halfway around the world, not just halfway down the street or halfway across the city. So foreign aid is important because it deals with America's influence around the world, and in particular, our ability to influence things towards our national interests. But foreign aid is not charity, although it may be charitable, and although it may be motivated by us in our efforts to advance our principles and the things that we think are right. Foreign aid is not charity. Foreign aid is designed to further our national interests. That means that every single dime that we give in foreign aid should be conditioned towards our national interest, should be about furthering our national interest. And I think that's true all over the world, everywhere we give it, whether it's military aid or foreign aid or what have you, economic aid. But I think today we have one example of a place where we really should start to examine how we give our foreign aid and examine it in a way that allows us to maximize our national interest. And that country that I want to talk about today is Egypt. There's a lot of concerning things happening in Egypt. Now, we've all been witness to the amazing Arab Spring and all the changes that it brought about to the region, potentially democracy, etc. And Egypt obviously has been a prime example of that, a country where all this has been occurring. And it's brought to power a government that largely is governed today by the Muslim Brotherhood. And here's the good news. The good news is that these changes have occurred and that theoretically there's a more open society. The bad news is that some of the people who have been brought to power bring with them an ideology that at times is troubling and, in fact, in practice, has been deeply troubling. For example, we have seen efforts in Egypt to undermine democratic institutions. We have seen efforts in Egypt to undermine the judiciary. We have seen open examples in Egypt of freedom of religion being undermined. We've seen women and women's rights regress. We've seen irresponsible economic behavior in Egypt. And we can talk about the causes of all this, but this is the reality of what's going on in Egypt. In addition to that, we should be deeply concerned about Egypt's ability or willingness to live up to their security arrangements with their neighbors, particularly our strong allies in Israel. They have a commitment that they made years ago to securing the Sinai, to preventing weapons and terrorists and others from crossing through the Sinai and into the Gaza Strip and into Israel. This is a commitment and an obligation that they have. And we should be concerned about their unwillingness or inability or both to live up to these commitments. So what I'm asking for in this amendment is for us to re-examine the way we give foreign aid to Egypt, not to get rid of it. Because let me tell you, there's a real danger that we can start to lose some of these foreign aid programs. The American people are fed up with story after story of countries that are benefiting from our generosity, and then they open up the newspaper and they read inflammatory comments that they're making about us. They open up the newspaper or turn on cable television and they see reports from these countries where democracy is being undermined, where the rights of women are being trampled, where religious minorities are being persecuted. And they have a right to ask, why are we giving so much money to these countries? Now, we actually have a record in Egypt of working very closely with their military organizations, and we hope that that can continue. But we also want to ensure that Egypt continues to move towards a direction of true democracy. Democracy is not just having elections. Having elections is one part of democracy. You have to govern like a democrat. You have to govern in an open process. where you allow people to speak out, opposition parties to organize, a court system that doesn't skew things in your favor and against the opposition. You don't just have to have elections to have a democracy. You need a lot more than that. And so we saw last week where former Senator Kerry, now Secretary of State, awarded a sum. And by the way, we've given about over $70 billion of aid to Egypt since the 1940s. That's not an insignificant sum. But we look now at the $250 million in aid that they received last week, and I believe that was unfortunate. We have significant interest in ensuring that Egypt remains at peace with Israel, that the Morsi government does not undermine the democratic process, and that human and political rights of all Egyptians, including that of religious minorities and women, are respected. And our foreign aid should reflect that. So what this amendment, which I intend to propose, does is a few things. Let me begin by saying this is not about canceling foreign aid to Egypt per se. This is about restructuring it in a way that lines up with the national interests of the taxpayers of the United States of America. And I'll have more to say about this amendment when the appropriate time to file it comes up, but let me just briefly describe it and hope to gain support from my colleagues and the public at large. The first is that it would block the disbursement of additional economic support funds and new, not the existing, but new foreign military financing contracts until Egypt begins to enact economic reforms and the administration certifies that Egypt has done a few of the following things. It's adopted and implemented legal reforms which protect the political, the economic, and religious freedoms. It's not acting to restrict the political, economic, and religious freedoms and human rights of the citizens and residents of Egypt. It's continuing to demonstrate a commitment to free and fair elections and is not taking any steps to interfere with or undermine the credibility of such elections. Another condition is that it's lifted restrictions in law and practice on the work and the funding of Egyptian and international NGOs, non-governmental organizations, comprising those in human rights and democracy field. Those include the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House. That it's fully implementing the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. That it's taking all the necessary actions to eliminate smuggling networks and to detect and destroy tunnels between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, tunnels that are used to smuggle weapons and terrorists into the Gaza Strip. And it's taking all other necessary actions to combat terrorism in an increasingly ungovernable space of the Sinai. The second thing it does is it begins to recalibrate the U.S.-Egypt security relationship towards Egypt's actual security needs. Now let me say this, it does not appear, and I don't know if anyone would disagree with this, that Egypt is an imminent threat, has any imminent threat of being invaded by any one of their neighbors. It's not going to happen. Egypt's real security needs are its ability, number one, to live up to its obligations, to stamp out terrorism within its borders, in particular to secure the Sinai, to close those tunnels that lead to Gaza. But its second security need that it has is internal, in particular street crime. Now, one of the ways that Egypt is going to be able to rebuild its economy is through tourism. And I'm not a tourism expert, but I think that muggings and murder and kidnappings, these things are not good for tourism. People don't usually visit countries where these things are happening. This is the actual aid that Egypt needs in terms of its security. It doesn't need tanks. It doesn't need jet fighters. It's not going to be invaded by a foreign country. That's not its real threats. I understand their desire to have those things. And by the way, there are existing contracts to give them those things. But their real security needs are largely internal. And we want to recalibrate our military aid in the future to Israel to meet their actual needs. And in that end, one of the things that the amendment would require is an analysis of Egypt's security requirements produced by the Department of Defense in consultation with the Egyptian government and to be shared with the relevant congressional committees here, both in the House and Senate. We also want the administration to certify that the Department of Defense has allocated a portion of Egypt's foreign military financing, no less than $100 million, towards counterterrorism tools, including the equipment and training related to border security and to address the instability in the Sinai. And we also want to report on all FMF contracts that the Department of Defense has carried out over the last 10 years, as well as the department's plans for contracting over the next decade. I think it's wise to look at what we've done in the past, to fully understand the contributions that the American taxpayer has made to Egypt's security in the past. But also, we need to see the contracts that are pending moving forward. And all these things need to be aligned so that we can ensure that the aid we're giving them isn't just what they want. It, in fact, is what they need within the confines of what's in our national security and what's in our national interest, because once again, this is our money. Last but not least, we should begin to shift U.S. assistance away from military programs and increasingly towards civilian assistance. So what this amendment would do is it would require the administration to begin a dialogue with the Egyptian government and with Egyptian civil society about the need to rebalance our system away from its current, almost obsessive focus on military aid by reallocating economic funds not provided to Egypt during periods when certification is not in effect towards democracy and governance programs, including direct support for secular, democratic, non-governmental organizations, as well as programming and support for rule of law and human rights, good governance, political competition, and consensus building, and civil society. We should look at transferring the interest earned in Egypt's account. You know, they have this account where this money sits when we give this aid. Those accounts are a lot of money. They'll generate a lot of interest. What happens to that interest is we should be able to take that interest that's generated from these funds and reallocate them. Reallocate them make them available and allocate these funds for democracy and for governance efforts. And last but not least, we should require the President to submit a report to the Congress describing the specific results of an Egypt policy review that includes a dialogue with the government of Egypt and also civil society, and on how to rebalance the U.S. military and economic assistance. Now, as most of these bills will have in them, this is going to have a national security waiver. In essence, if the Secretary of State comes to us and says it's in our national security not to implement or fully implement this amendment at this time, as they do with almost all aid programs, they would have the right to do that. But they're going to have to do it every 180 days, at least twice a year, so we can be sure that we're keeping up with the transition that's going on in Egypt. Now, let me briefly address a few of the arguments that are going to come against this potentially. One is that we have this incredibly strong relationship with Egypt, and that we don't want to undermine with the Egyptian military, and we don't want to undermine that. This is not intended to do that. We value that relationship. We hope it can continue to grow stronger. But the reality of it is that, number one, these are hard-earned taxpayer dollars. At a time when the United States of America really doesn't have a lot of money to throw away. In fact, it has no money to throw away. So we have to ensure that the aid we give is aid that's effective, that's actually doing what it needs to be doing, not simply going to a wish list of some general or military official somewhere. This is not about cutting off the Egyptian military. This is about recalibrating our relationship with them to ensure that what we're making available to them is not just what they want, but it's what they need. And that's the first thing I would say in that argument. The second argument I would have, and we hope this day will never come, but as Egypt continues to transition, we don't know what the Egyptian military is going to look like 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. In fact, many of the top people we've been dealing with in the past aren't in those positions anymore. They've been replaced by the new government. And I would tell you that if history is a lesson, if the Morsi government and the Muslim Brotherhood take Egypt in a direction that's not in our national interest, that's not in the best interest of the region, our allies, or the world, they're not going to be able to do that unless they replace the military leadership with people who agree with them on these things. And so while we hope that never happens, we hope to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. We hope that the Egyptian military will continue to be governed and run by professional military men and women. We can't guarantee that. And we don't know what the Egyptian military will look like 5 years from now or 3 years from now. And that's why it's so important that this waiver provision require the Secretary of State to do so twice a year, so we can keep up on the recent events, because who would have predicted 3 years ago that the events that happened in Egypt would have happened in our time? And yet they did. And so we can't predict what Egypt's going to look like 3 years from now. We hope it will be better, but we don't know. The other argument that I've heard is, well, this is going to offend their sovereignty. They don't like us to tell them what to do with the aid that we give them. The Egyptians are not going to take kindly to the idea of the United States dictating things to them. Well, I quite frankly don't understand that argument, because this is our money. They don't have to take our foreign aid. They don't have to accept it. But our foreign aid has never been, or should never have been, a blank check. This idea that somehow if we're going to make money available to people, it should be unconditional, quite frankly, doesn't make any sense to me. This is our money. If they don't want the aid, they don't have to take it. But if they're going to accept our aid, we should have some say in it. If it's the U.S. dollars of the U.S. taxpayer that's going towards these programs, shouldn't the American people, through their elected representatives and their government, have some say, if not a predominant amount of say, over how these dollars are spent and what these dollars are spent on? And shouldn't we ensure that those countries are headed in a positive direction, not in a direction that acts against our national interests? Now, look, I believe in foreign aid. I think foreign aid is important for the United States. But it needs to be done the right way. I think it needs to be done the right way across the board in all of our aid programs. But this is one that's pressing, that's right in front of us. I recently took a trip to the Middle East. I went to Jordan, I went to Israel, and in many places where I went, I heard over and over again, a lot of concern about the direction Egypt was headed in. And they're going through a balancing act right now, is what it appears. On the one hand, you have a deeply seated ideology that I think many people would find offensive. We've heard some of the past comments of the president of Egypt. We've heard some of the past comments of some of the leadership in the Muslim Brotherhood. It's downright offensive. And that's their ideology. And we've seen some of that seep through in their public policy making. We also understand that there's a pragmatic argument going on. They know that they cannot survive in government and in power if they don't have an economy. They know, at least I hope they know, that they have to take steps to reform their economy. They have to take steps to increase their security so that tourism will return. They know they need to do these things. And right now they're calibrating those two things. The pragmatism of needing to secure their country and needing to provide for economic growth versus their ideology. And some in their ideological base of the Muslim Brotherhood that are calling for a rapid expansion in Islamist-type rule. You can see those pressures building within Egyptian society in and of itself. I think USAID has an opportunity to tilt that conversation towards pragmatism. If we're smart about how we use our foreign aid, we can actually help tilt that conversation away from the ideology and towards the pragmatism, towards security that's not designed to crack down on internal dissent, that's not designed to one day wage war against their neighbors in Israel or anywhere else, but in fact is designed to provide security against common street crime, security against terrorism, to seal those tunnels in Gaza, to live up to their international obligations. I think that if we condition this the right way, we can help encourage them to take on the kind of economic reforms that Egypt needs to have the kind of economy they need. Because after all, that was the heart of the Arab Spring. The heart of the Arab Spring were hundreds of thousands of unemployed people, starting in Egypt particularly, who were desperate for a better future and didn't think they could find it. Then they looked at a government that they saw as repressive and corrupt, and they wanted to replace it. But not with this. And the reason why I feel so strongly about this is that as the Egyptian leaders are undertaking this cost-benefit analysis, should we lean more towards ideology or should we lean more towards pragmatism? Through our foreign aid, we actually have an opportunity to push them, to nudge them, to encourage them towards pragmatism. And I hope that's why I can achieve bipartisan support for this amendment. I hope people will find it to be thoughtful and insightful. And in the days to come, I look forward to addressing more questions that my colleagues may have on it. But for the time being, I hope that we're going to put some releases out about this, and I hope that some of my colleagues will become interested in helping us achieve its passage.